So welcome BookTube viewers to a new video. It's going to be a tag. The origin of this was Dane Reed's and it was his punk rock tag, and as you can see I'm fully prepared. I'm at such an age now I have a natural Mohican, no hair gel, no sugar soap, nothing, it just stands up. See? Anyway, I'll post a link to Dane's origin video. You should go and check it out because Dane properly does up like a punk in it and it's great. So there's 10 or 11 questions. Inspired by punk songs. I'm going to play the opening bars to most of those songs that I have in my record collection. I'll give you an interesting personal punk fact with my relationship to the question, and then I'm going to do the bookish answer. So on with the show. So the first one, God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols. So, name a book with a queen who ain't no human being. Well, I'm going to go for Genet's Lady of the Flowers. In the sense of the queen being not a queen in fairy stories or someone who rules over an empire, but a queen in the homosexual world, because Genet was gay, and he was also a prisoner for sort of petty thievery for quite a lot of his early life. And he wrote this book, Our Lady of the Flowers, while in prison. The first version of it was discovered and destroyed, but he managed to smuggle a second one out when having rewritten the whole thing. And basically it's a guy in a prison who's therefore sort of completely isolated on his own, and he sort of conjures up these fantasy men, and he basically, now how can I put this delicately, actually why should it be delicate, this is the punk rock tag. They're sort of masturbatory fantasies, and one of them is a sort of a queen figure. I can't remember her name, but she doesn't exist. None of these characters exist. It's all about him sort of trying to get by in jail through this sort of fantasy life. But she behaves very queenly. The point about these characters that he creates is they sort of become sort of more real than real and sort of dominate his life and sort of take over. So in the book they have the heft of real characters. So that would be my answer to that one. In terms of my personal fun fact, may not be fun, but anyway, I can't really remember how I sort of came to punk, but I do remember early on in 1977 I was at some family function which was sort of sit-down catered lunch in somebody's sort of garden with a marquee and all of that. And I just remember at age 14 or 13, I suppose I was then, discussing the Stranglers. It's a very sort of middle class, everyone in their sort of finery, Sunday finery, over whatever food we had. And I was discussing the Stranglers, which seemed to be the antithesis of punk, sort of a very sort of middle class setting. But there you go, that's kind of my first memory of sort of thinking and talking about punk. Okay, question 2, Pretty Vacant by the Sex Pistols. Another heavy riff. I wish I had been a musician. Okay. Name a book with a character who's pretty vacant. Pulitzer Prize winning author Jenny Egan, who wrote A Visit from the Goon Squad, which is about music, funny enough. But one of her earlier books was Look at Me, and there's a character, or the main character, and that's called Charlotte Swenson, and she's this sort of very successful model who has a car crash, and she has to have reconstructive surgery. And after that, the bulk of the book is this sort of pull between her glad that she can now pass by unrecognised and sort of have a sort of normal life, but there's also the counterpull of she regrets, you know, what celebrity life gave her. So that's working at her. But she has this gift where, because she knows that she sort of got a sort of a shadow side of her, she can recognise it in any other person that she comes across. You know, the person they're projecting is not the real person inside, and she's able to see the real person inside, which is a really interesting thing, but she doesn't use it to any end. So she might remark on somebody's shadow side, but then it goes nowhere, it's not developed. And then in the last third of the book, she virtually disappears. You know, she has no presence. It's absolutely bizarre. That's why I say she's pretty vacant, because she has this talent that she doesn't use. she's a bit empty and vain in the whole sort of supermodel thing and yearning for celebrity versus being her true self. And then she is literally vacant in the last third of the book because she's not in it. She just disappears. It's a bizarre book. It's not a great book. And my sort of personal fun fact, so the first ever punk gig I went to, I think I was about 14, and I went up to a venue called the Rainbow in Finsbury Park. Now Finsbury Park's where Johnny Rotten was sort of grew up, so it's you know, it has that sort of resonance. Anyway, the group I went to see were called Stiff Little Fingers from Northern Ireland, and as a 14-year-old I was terrified because punk had quite a bad reputation for sort of violence and sort of, you know, I was 14 and there were going to be loads of 18, 19 and perhaps adults in anyway, it passed off absolutely fine and sort of set me on a life of punk. But I'm going to return to the theme of violence in associated with punk later. Question 3. Ever fallen in love, brackets, with someone you shouldn't have fallen in love with, by the Buzzcocks? Now, the Buzzcocks are always sort of pop punk to me. Very quickly you sort of had the sort of harsh sort of punk of people like the Damned and the Sex Pistols, but then you had this sort of pop punk side with the Buzzcocks and the Undertones, who we come on to later. And I suppose I veered more to the pop punk side of things. Anyway, the question is, name a book with a character who fell in love with someone they shouldn't have fallen in love with. That strikes me as almost any book with a relationship at the heart of it, because without the will they, won't they, should they, shouldn't they, you don't have any dramatic tension. But anyway, specifically, the book I want to talk about is David Grossman's Be My Knife, where a guy works in, I think he's a writer, the character, and he spots a woman in a book festival. And he starts corresponding with her. So the novel is epistolary. And we get about 200 pages of this guy's angst-ridden, neurotic. He's basically writing to her about their relationship, which sort of doesn't really exist, and his love for her. But actually he's writing about himself, and it's just tedious in the extreme. And then they meet and they consummate, and then the last third of the book is given to her. But it's just a relationship that's just dreadful, because it's not really a relationship. It's one guy emoting about his own feelings. It's incredibly self-indulgent. And my first, as I say, sort of I veered to the pop punk side of punk, but quickly that sort of developed into what was called New Wave, which the criticism of punk was it was basically sort of, you know, primitive rock and roll riffs, not very lyrically sophisticated. And very soon after that, you had an offshoot called New Wave. I know there was New Wave in America, which is something different. But the New Wave in Britain was bands like Gang of Four, Delta 5, the Au Pairs, who to this day are still some of my favourite groups, where you suddenly got the possibility of men and women as equals in bands. You know, previously, if a woman had been in a band, she was probably either a backing singer or she sort of struck a tambourine or something. But this sort of group of sort of British new wave bands, they were generally equality, where, you know, the instruments were divided equally, and like Delta 5 were dominated by women. I think there was only one guy in it, and they were making quite political music. This was the early 80s by then, and we had Mrs. Thatcher in power, so there was a lot to sing and protest about. And the music was interesting, it was very angular, and Johnny Rotten had left the Sex Pistols and formed Public Image Limited, which was an all-male band, but what they were doing musically, you know, just offered a whole new sort of possibility of sort of interesting music. Unfortunately, sort of Public Image sort of then got signed by a major label, and they sort of became a lot more sort of commercial and popular. But it was an interesting time in music, and there was definitely some possibilities out there. Next question, 4. I Want to Be Sedated by the Ramones. Okay, well, as the Ramones is very quick, this won't last long. So, name a book that made you want to be sedated. Now, is that sedated because you get so wound up and agitated by the book, or is that a book that sends you into sedation? So if it's a book that sends you to sedation, that's Skippy Dies by Paul Murray, which the clue's in the title. So it's set in a school, a boarding school in Ireland, and there's a student called Skippy, and the book is in 3 sort of small paperback volumes in a box set, which I couldn't understand why it needed that, but anyway, and it just takes you through sort of Skippy's tedious adolescence of unrequited crushes and all this sort of stuff. There is a bit of quantum physics thrown in now and again, but it's just dire. You know where it's heading. He's not going to live to graduate, and it put me in a coma. And when Skippy died, I didn't shed a tear. I shed a sigh of relief. It was just dreadful. It was quite highly thought of. I think it got nominated for the Booker long list, but I mean, I really couldn't see why. There's nothing special about it at all. But if it's a question of a book that sort of stirs you up so that you need sedating afterwards, I'm going to do Clarice Lispector's Agua Viva, which is quite a short book, but there's just so much to sort of contemplate and think about in that book. So the character was an artist, a painter, trying to sort of encapsulate life in her paintings. And in the book, she's now switched to being a writer. And she's trying to capture life through words, which is like a different thing on her easel than when she was a painter. And there's just some amazing stuff, meditative stuff to think about. So I'm going to quote something from it. So writing is the method of using words as bait. The word fishing for whatever is not word. When this non-word between the lines takes the bait, something has been written. Once whatever is between the lines is caught, the word can be tossed away in relief. And it's just, I needed to be sedated after that because there was so much to grapple with. I mean, I love that book. I'm going to reread it one day. So that was my sort of, I want to be sedated. Obviously, punk was associated with drug use like any music trend, but punk was about amphetamine, so it's the opposite of being sedated. It was about having sort of more energy, more speed. You know, its dance was the pogo, which is a very frenetic dance. But all that got thrown into relief when Sid Vicious died of a heroin overdose. So heroin, of course, is the sort of ultimate sedative drug that just sends you to sleep. So, but that wasn't actually my personal fact because I have no involvement with drugs. Yes, the Ramones. So I don't know if you saw about a couple of years ago, everyone in the high street was wearing a Ramones shirt. And you thought, wait a minute, have they come, you know, they made a comeback or whatever. And what you realise is that their brand of the sort of American Eagle sort of circle thing was being produced in high street shops as sort of, you know, everyday fashion. So it's H&M, Sports Direct, and what was the other one? Primark. So all these sort of cheap high street clothes outlets were knocking out these Ramones shirts, and that was the problem with punk. That the moment it became successful as a music of protest and alternative, all the major record labels, all the sort of, you know, capitalist corporate entities wanted their own punk band and signed them up. And this is what inevitably happens to any sort of new artistic movement. It gets corporatized because it shows that it can earn money. And that was the sad fate of punk, and the even sadder fate of the Ramones, I felt. Okay, next question, 5. London Calling, The Clash. Okay. Name a book set in London in which a character lives by, or in which a character lives by the river. I'm going to name Kraken by China Miéville, which is one of the worst books I've ever read. But Miéville sets it in London. Miéville is obviously, he lives in London. He's obviously, you know, smitten by London as I am. And the plot of the book is there's the sort of the straight people who live sort of our lives, our regular lives, but underneath that there's a level of people who are sort of magic inspired, a bit like sort of X-Men's mutants, and there are two gangs of them are at war in London, and one of the flaws of the book is that they never, you know, whatever's going on in their world, never affects the above ground people like us. So what's the point of it? But anyway, and there's a lot about London in the book, and there's a lot of references to sort of London speech, London gangsterism, and one of my favourite all-time TV shows from the 70s was called The Sweeney, which was a police detective drama. Sweeney being the flying squad, because in Cockney rhyming slang, Sweeney Todd rhymes with flying squad. And they were sort of a mobile armed response unit to sort of bank robbers and delivery lorry robberies. And the beauty of that show is they didn't always catch the villain, but sometimes the villains won. So you never, unlike Starsky and Hutch, which you knew by the hour's end, you knew the villain would be behind bars. That wasn't the case in The Sweeney. And they had this sort of patter, which is sort of both the detectives sort of patter, but also the criminals, because they had their own sort of coded language. And Melville reproduces some of this stuff in the novel, and it's brilliant. But unfortunately, the flaws of the novel overwhelm the rest of it, I feel. Okay, and my personal fact, The Clash, yes, of course. So I never saw The Clash live, which was a great regret to me, because I remember I was on a train coming home from a gig by The Fall, who were probably the band I saw the most. And The Fall was sort of definitely anti-punk. I mean, they sort of had similar values, but they kept saying they were not punk. And I saw them about 15, 20 times. I was on a train home, and I realised that there must have been a Clash concert on the same night, because there were lots of Clash fans. And I sat there thinking, I've never seen the Clash. I kind of wish I'd gone to the Clash that night instead of The Fall, just for once. But I think the Clash by then was sort of regarded as a sort of stadium rock band, and that's probably why I hadn't gone. But I love the Clash. They did lots of sort of reggae cover versions, done sort of punk style, or actually penned their own reggae style punk songs that are so good you think they must have been originally reggae songs from Jamaica, but they weren't. They were by the Clash. And the other thing about the Clash is that punk in its early days was very much associated with the audience spitting at the band on stage. And Joe, a drummer of the Clash, actually contracted hepatitis through basically accidentally swallowing someone's spit. So punk was never going to have a long life if that was the relationship of audience and band. Okay, next question. Yes, The Passenger, Iggy Pop and the Stooges. Actually, no, this wasn't with the Stooges, was it? I'm not sure. This might have been an Iggy Pop solo, but anyway. The question is, name a book in which a character is a passenger and rides through the city's backside. So this is a book called Alphabet City by Stephen Knight. Now Stephen Knight went on to create the TV show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and has written film screenplays, and has written a very successful historical crime drama called Peaky Blinders. So, I mean, he's really moved on from novels, and I don't think people associate him with novels, but I read Alphabet City when it came out, and it's set in Alphabet City in New York, which at the time was a very run down part of the city, and it was called Alphabet City because the street names were 8th Street, Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, etc. And it's a brilliant book because basically a sociologist has written a book as if he had gone to do a sort of field study in Alphabet City about all its crime and everything, but he never set foot there. The book becomes a huge success, and he's obviously afraid that he's going to be revealed that he never actually set foot in there. And the problem is that some of the events he wrote about were obviously criminal, people being bumped off and drug deals and stuff. So the police come to him sort of saying, we want we want the evidence, we want to try and nab this sort of kingpin in Alphabet City. And gradually the events that he wrote about start coming true, during this time. And he gets more and more sort of embroiled with the police who are after him. Maybe this gangster's after him that he's written, even though the gangster didn't, all the acts he's referring to, those people didn't exist. And it's a very clever book, and I really, it's a shame that he went on to write in other medium, because I think, you know, he's a bit of a loss to fiction. But anyway, and yes, Iggy Pop. So I used to know a music journalist called Cynthia Rose, who was Iggy Pop's boyfriend when he was living in England. And Cynthia Rose not only was Iggy Pop's boyfriend, but she's actually name-checked in a Prince song. I can't remember which one, but there's a line just like Cynthia Rose. So how cool is that, that you're the boyfriend of Iggy Pop and you're name-checked in a Prince song? So, you know, respect to Cynthia. She's since left England and gone back to live in Texas, where she was from. But, you know, dead impressive woman. Okay, question 7. Teenage Kicks, the Undertones. Name a book that has the best you ever had and makes you want to hold it tight and get teenage kicks right through the night. I'm not sure what this question's asking exactly. Name a book that was the best you ever had. Well, you know, I've got a top 20. I could do that. And makes you want to hold it tight. Hold a book tight? No, not really. And get teenage kicks right through the night. Okay. I don't know how to respond to this, so I'm going to take a punt. I could have completely misconstrued it. There are 2 books by the author Nicholson Baker, which are very sexy. One is called Vox, which is 2 characters having phone sex, that's the whole book. And it's brilliant because, you know, if you think about sort of talking about sex, it tends to be cheesy and kind of, you know, just crass. But Barker makes a literary novel out of it, and it's fantastic. The other is called The Fermata, which is a bit of a guilty pleasure, especially in this age of Me Too, because the main character has an ability. When he takes off his glasses, he stops time for everyone else, and he can move. Everyone is frozen, and he can move among them. So what does he use with this gift? Well, he peers at women's décolletage. Doesn't really do anything sort of beyond that, but you know, in these days, or even when he was writing, that is a form of sexual assault. So, but it is, you know, despite that sort of potential for offence, it's actually a very good novel. So those are the sort of teenage kicks responses. As to my personal fun fact about the Undertones, I never saw them once live, and they were stupendous. They were possibly the best live band. As I say, because they were sort of pop punk, it was sort of on the sort of party side of dancing. And I saw them at a venue called the Hammersmith Palais, which is on the end of one of the tube lines, Hammersmith. And by the 3rd encore, I heard that, and then I dashed to get my train because I didn't want to miss the last train home. And because it was the end of the line, the train was sat there for a couple of minutes before it set off, and the doors were open. And I could hear they'd gone back on for a 4th encore, the bastards. But they were just fantastic. And the lead singer, Fergal Sharkey, actually broke the band up because he left, not to go and form his own band or have a particularly significant solo career, although I think he did release one solo album. But very quickly, he ended up as a talent scout for one of the major labels, which I think is bizarre because he's obviously a creative person in his own right, released these great records. And then he sort of went to the other side of it, which is sort of, you know, talent spotting. Very odd decision. And he's still in that line of business as far as I know. So that was Fergal Sharkey. Okay, now we come to 3 questions of Danes, which are accompanied by American bands, and I don't know these bands, so you'll be glad to know you won't hear the intro music or me throwing shapes along to them. So the first one is Fat Lip by a band called Sum 41, and I must admit I've never heard this song, and I don't know Sum 41 at all. Name a mainstream book that makes you not want to waste your time becoming another casualty of society. Well, if I read a mainstream book, I already have become a casualty of society, in my view. But that aside, I'm going to talk about Philip Roth's book, American Pastoral, which is a brilliant book. It's in my all-time top 20. So it's about a sort of, someone who's well established in the community, a successful businessman called, nicknamed Swede Lvov is his surname. And he has a teenage daughter who basically is part of the 60s counterculture, ends up committing a terrorist act, and he goes to confront, she's sort of on the run, and he sort of confronts her, and it's very much this battle representing the 60s in America of the mainstream and the counterculture. And it's brilliantly done. It's brilliantly written. I mean, Roth is such a smart, intuitive, keen-eyed observer. And, you know, even though that obviously I'd be rooting for the daughter, she's such a wash-up. And you realise that this is where the 60s went so tragically wrong for progressives in America. You know, that for all the things about sort of, you know, students confronting their teachers, university kids confronting their lecturers, the anti-war sort of campaign, civil rights, you know, of all of them, civil rights, which, you know, seem to be eroding now under Trump. But anyway, that was a lasting achievement. But the rest of it, all it did was set mainstream America on, you know, it sort of got their hackles up, and they've reacted ever since. And that's why you had things like Reagan. You know, it's a real sort of counter-revolution. Both the UK and America, I think, have been sort of suffering under that ever since. And the progressivism has been set back ever since. And this is, you know, it wasn't that they were misguided in their values. It's just somewhere along the line, they, you know, their tactics were wrong, and they didn't try and take and move the majority of the population towards their side. They just sort of stuck outside and sort of provoked it. Sort of like, you know, shaking a bee's hive. So, but it's a brilliant book. And personal fact for me, so sort of punk died out and all the big punk bands became stadium bands. But then in the sort of mid-80s, it sort of got a new lease of life in Britain, where you had the anarcho-punk movement, which is a much more politically focused, ideologically focused movement about sort of green and environmentalism, rejecting capitalism, living in communes. And the main bands associated with this were people like Crass and Conflict. And the thing about them is Crass's first single was called Reality Asylum. And it was this sort of diatribe against Christ and against religion. And no record plant would press the record in the UK. They actually had to get it pressed in France. But ironically, as their communities built up, and the sort of devotion of their fans, you know, Crass became a religion in their own right. So there was a sort of irony there. The band, I was never particularly into Crass. I was more into a band called Conflict, who sort of fell out with them. And I went to a Conflict gig, and even though by this time I was a grown-up adult, I was quite scared about that, because again, there's association with violence. One of the things that those bands did, because they were sort of very strongly animal rights, is they did a lot of things like hunt saboteuring and things like that. So there was a sort of an undercurrent of violence amongst the sort of pacifism. So again, a sort of a contradiction. 9. Self-Esteem by The Offspring. Well, I have heard of The Offspring, but I'm not familiar with their oeuvre. Name a book that you struggle through, because the more you suffer, the more it shows you really care. Well, a book I really struggled with, and it didn't show I cared, but I did get to the end, was Victor Pelevin's Empire 5, The Prince of Hamlet. Now, I love Victor Pelevin. He's great. He's sort of a Buddhist science fiction writer, if you can imagine such a thing. And I think Empire 5 was his last book that he's released. And basically, they're all set in Russia, where he's from. And a man and a teenage man and a teenage woman both get bitten by vampires. And the book is them being trained and taught into how to act like a vampire, fundamentally, which is not giving yourself away, but to sort of seem as though you can blend in, and how to manipulate human beings. And the whole book is a series of effectively lectures by these older vampires to these two younger minions. And that's the problem with the book. There's no, you know, it's a disaster as a plot. There is no plot. It's just Pelevin talking at you, the reader, about all these ideas here. And the ideas are great. I mean, it's some really interesting stuff about sort of Buddhism versus materialism, the human place in the cosmos, and you know, the scale of other creatures in human life and how that sort of stacks up. So there's some really interesting ideas, but it's just unreadable, because it is just the author talking at you through the guise of these two neophytes being trained, and it's terrible. But I did battle on through to the end of it. I'm not sure it showed I cared, or maybe I was interested enough in the ideas. But anyway, that's my answer for that one. On the personal front, so since we're talking about American bands that I'm not familiar with, I'm going to talk about an American band I am familiar with, which are the Dead Kennedys, who were one of the best live bands I've ever seen. I don't know if the lead singer Jello Biafra had sort of drama teaching, but his performance on stage, it suggested to me that he had. And when I saw them the first time, they were supported by 2 British punk bands, but also an American punk band called MDC, which stood for Millions of Dead Cops. And I bought their sort of mini LP, so I was familiar with their work before the gig, and they're great. But quite a few of the members of that band were gay, and there was another band called Bad Brains, who from Boston, who were a sort of punk reggae band. But they were all sort of committed Rastafarians, and they had a problem with MDC because in their Rastafarian faith they couldn't abide the notion of homosexuality. So those 2 bands were at each other's throats. So, even in something like punk rock, which is supposed to be sort of egalitarian and non-hierarchical, there is still sort of, political points of conflict. So that was that. Question 10, Basket Case by Green Day. Well, obviously everyone's heard of Green Day, but again, I'm not familiar with their work. Name a book with a character who was a melodramatic fool, neurotic to the bone, no doubt about it. Well, one you could say is Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, who is neurotic and melodramatic. I've talked about him in another tag, so I'm not going to talk about him. I'm going to talk about a book by Jonathan Lethem, which interestingly had a different name. It was called A Gambler's Anatomy in the US, which is what I asked for in the bookshop, and they couldn't find it because for some reason in the UK it got changed to The Blot, which, if you don't know, is what the pieces in backgammon are called. They're called blots. And it is about this character, Alexander Bruno, who's a professional backgammon player. And he has a sort of a sponsor, and they go around the world and they basically, they hustle at backgammon in these very sort of ornate, rich people's houses. They go and play and take money off them. But he has literally a sort of a visual blot in his sight, which may or may not be caused by a tumour. And it gets worse and worse at the start of the book. And he has to be operated on, a sort of life-saving operation that's never been undertaken before. But to do that, his whole face is peeled off. So when he's sort of out of surgery, he very quickly commissions a mask because he can't bear to be seen, in this sort of, lacerated face state. And the person who paid for this surgery, because it's very, very expensive, is an old childhood friend of his who's made it big in the tech world, who sort of goes around in sandals and Hawaiian shorts, who he hates, but he's totally beholden to him. And for his recuperation, this friend says, "Oh, you must come to my, where I live in California, which is a little area of ground that he's bought out all the land, and he's sort of developed various things. So his office is there, but he's also got a hamburger joint and a clothes sort of fashion joint. It all sort of reflects this entrepreneur sort of techie, geeky lifestyle, which is just anathema to Alexander Bruno. So on the one hand, he's accepting the silver dollar off this guy because he's totally beholden to him. And on the other, he's sort of having these sort of thoughts that he'd like to burn it all down to the ground. And he hates being reliant on him. And he is melodramatic. And he is, what was the other thing? Oh yes, neurotic. And he's not actually at all sympathetic. But what made the book for me is the 2 female characters are beautifully drawn and much more sort of rounded and depth than this guy, who's just a seething mass of neurosis. The first woman is the partner of the tech guy. And the second one is when he sort of fell ill and collapsed, that needed this this life-saving operation. It was in the house of someone who was playing backgammon in, I think it was in Germany. And the guy had hired basically a prostitute to stand there naked and serve the food. And she basically saves his life. She's the one who sort of, gets the ambulance and everything. And he brings her over to America, or invites her over to America, and they sort of start having a relationship. And she has nothing really. She's very sort of at the bottom of the social scale and has no resources. But she's beautifully drawn, and I really felt for that relationship, as well as the one between him and the geek's partner. So it's a bit of a melange of a book, but it's, those two female characters were, you know, more than enough for me to save it. And my final personal punk fact is returning to the Rainbow venue, which is where I saw my first ever gig. I went to see the Jam. Again, it was in Hammersmith. And the Jam were a band that definitely started off punk, but quickly became sort of mod, and then became the biggest sort of alternative band in the UK. And every single they released went to #1. Very political. And again, I saw them lots and lots of times. But when I went to see them at the Hammersmith Palais, the night before they played at the Rainbow. Was it? Yeah, they'd played the Rainbow, and there'd been another venue in Finsbury Park where a punk band, a second generation punk band called The Exploited, had played. And the two audiences had to come out at the same time. The Exploited fans set upon the Jam fans and beat them up quite badly. And so when I was in the audience for the Jam the next night, it was really tense. You know, there was, you know, is this going to happen again? Are Exploited fans going to come looking for them and stuff? So that was an incredible atmosphere and an incredible gig, because the Jam on stage fed off this. You know, they had a very good relationship with their audience, and you know, so violence did occur in punk. Not to me personally, I was never a victim of it. I never saw it, but the next day, for the fallout of it, I did experience. So there you have it. There are my 10 questions on the punk theme, with some personal observations. Question 11 is Sheila is a Punk Rocker by the Ramones. Tag your most punk rock booktube friends to take this tag. I'm the most punk rock booktuber, and I'll fight anyone who says that I'm not. But seriously, I mean, punk was about egalitarianism. It was about do it yourself. There was an early punk fanzine called Sniffing Glue, which had a drawing of a guitar fretboard, and it sort of drew dots for where your fingers were to go. And it sort of did that for 3 chords. It said, here's chord 1, here's chord 2, here's chord 3, now go form a band. And that's kind of my attitude to BookTube. You know, all you need is a smartphone, or in my case, the FaceTime camera on my computer, a cheap, look at that, that's my microphone. That cost me about £7, which is about $10. And away you go. I mean, that is the spirit of punk, so go for it. So I'd like to thank Dane for a fantastic tag, one that's quite personal to me. I'd never threatened to dress up for it like he did, and much respect to him for that. I shall post the link to Dane's tag. I'll also post a link to, again, I've done this once before. I stuck a toe in the world of stand-up comedy, and I did a 10-minute routine live once to an audience, and then I recorded it the next day back at home. So I'll post a link to that, because it's all about me as a 50-year-old man looking back on my days as a punk. It's done for comedy, it's exaggerated, it's not strictly true, but hopefully you get a few laughs out of that. So thank you very much. I'm going to try and edit this with the music intros. It's going to be a nightmare, but there you go. Till next time, thanks very much. Oh yeah.